Recently, I was having a discussion with a few friends, and the question, what's the best legendary Pokemon, came up. And with choices spanning 9 generations, we all had different answers. One friend said Lugia, another said Mewtwo. I said the correct answer, Rayquaza. And finally, someone mentioned Darkrai. But Darkrai isn't a legendary, it's mythical. And I can't blame them for this confusion. Arguably one of the most inconsistent aspects of the franchise is the classification of mythical Pokemon. And this one conversation made me realize all the other issues I had with this subset. So from Mew all the way to Pecharunt, what's the problem? Well, to start, I think it's worth defining the distinction between legendary and mythical, each having their own unique characteristics and criteria. Legendary Pokemon are typically found within the game itself, and are often integral to the storyline or major events within the game's region, and they're usually encountered through specific in-game events or locations. On the other hand, mythical Pokemon are a special subset of rare Pokemon that are not usually available through normal gameplay. Mythical Pokemon are often shrouded in mystery and possess unique lore or abilities that set them apart from other Pokemon. They are typically given out during special events, promotions, or distributions outside of the main game. Now this isn't a hard and fast rule either, considering mythical Pokemon such as Deoxys appears in the Delta episode portion of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, or Keldeo appearing in the Crown Tundra DLC for Sword and Shield. The distinction between mythical and legendary gets even more confusing when considering Pokemon pairs like Cresselia and Darkrai. Otherwise known as the Lunar Duo, these Pokemon embody the contrasting themes of dreams and nightmares, with Cresselia linked to positive dreams and restful sleep, and Darkrai associated with not only nightmares, but the fear that come along with them. This to me has always made their mythos feel so much more dynamic. I can't think of one without the other. So why is only Darkrai considered mythical? This brings me to my first issue, Inconsistent Qualification. In my opinion, the first 3 generations of Pokemon did a fairly good job of making mythical Pokemon feel deserving of their status. They were not only rare and difficult to obtain, but they also had rich lore and unique abilities that made them feel special. Mew, for instance, is known as the common ancestor of all Pokemon, with its DNA containing the genetic code for all other species, as well as it being the key role in creating one of the most iconic things from the 90s, besides maybe O.J. Simpson. Mewtwo. Celebi, though not being tied to any other Pokemon, is still just as significant. It's the time-traveling onion of the Ilex Forest that symbolizes hope and the protection of nature. And in Generation 3, there were 2 mythical Pokemon introduced. Jirachi has always felt like the weaker of the two, with Deoxys having multiple forms, each boosting a different stat, and the fact that it's a literal space virus that has a rivalry with Rayquaza. I don't think you can get cooler than that. Anyways, Generation 4 is when the cracks really started showing. Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum introduced many Pokemon, including those that were essentially deities, with legendaries like Palkia, Dialga, Giratina, and Regigigas. This is also the generation that introduced the mythical Arceus. And for the few of you who don't know, Arceus is Pokemon God, literally, with its dex entry talking of how it crafted the universe with its 1,000 arms. Now how are you going to introduce something as significant as this in the same generation as Manaphy, who is really nothing more than just water Togepi? What does it do? It hatches eggs and stuff. All jokes aside, I know there's lore to Manaphy as well as Fione, and with Legends Arceus, there was an entire side quest dedicated to these two, and that's something I can really appreciate. But when comparing Arceus to Manaphy, only one really seems qualified for the title mythical. Another example of qualification inconsistency can be seen with the Pokemon introduced in Generation 5, Genesect. Genesect's origin story involves being a prehistoric Pokemon that was revived and technologically altered by Team Plasma to become the ultimate weapon. This backstory gives Genesect a fairly compelling reason to exist, with themes that tie to the ethical implications of genetic modification and technological enhancements. But where have we seen this before? Another Pokemon with an ancient origin that was taken advantage of and modified by an evil team is none other than Mewtwo. Mewtwo's story is basically identical, with it being created by Team Rocket through the genetic manipulation of Mew's DNA, intended to be the most powerful Pokemon and serve as a weapon. And despite this comparison, Genesect is the only one considered mythical. And it's not like they couldn't change this classification. I mean, the term mythical Pokemon was only introduced in Generation 5, 15 years after the franchise began. Another thing worth noting is that Mewtwo has had a fairly substantial amount of mystery gifts or event-exclusive appearances every few years or so. And if the real-world qualification for mythical Pokemon is that they're mainly found through events, I think Mewtwo would be a perfect candidate. Mythicals from later generations often feel hit or miss when it comes to being qualified. Pokemon such as Hoopa have the characteristics expected of this status. Others like Zeraora or Zarude don't quite measure up to these standards. The lore surrounding Hoopa's power to not only summon legendary Pokemon through its rings, but also be able to control them is so interesting, as well as its eventual confinement due to how powerful it truly is. Whereas both Zeraora and Zarude are kind of just generic guardians of their respective habitats. I also want to point out with Zarude specifically that it was introduced the same region we got a grass monkey as a starter. Has nothing to do with the video, it just has bugged me for years now, so you guys have to hear it too. Meltan is another example where its introduction feels extremely gimmicky. Its introduction through Pokemon Go, while it is innovative, it seems to prioritize the novelty of cross-platform integration over interesting lore or a compelling backstory. And it's not like I dislike Meltan. I actually think its design is fairly unique. I like the fact that it was considered a deity by ancient people just because it could create metal. And the idea of a mythical Pokemon being able to evolve is a really interesting idea, but it just falls flat with how many other mythical Pokemon are being introduced. And this brings me to my next issue, Oversaturation. It's only natural that the number of mythical Pokemon being introduced diminishes their unique status and the excitement that comes along with them. We talked about the earlier generations with both Gen 1 and Gen 2 introducing one mythical each. Generation 3 introduced 2, but from Generation 4 through Generation 8, there were 18 mythical Pokemon introduced. And as of now in Generation 9, only one more has been revealed. The best way I've been able to describe this issue is by comparing it to another archetype of Pokemon that gets introduced every generation. The pseudo-legendary. A big part of the hype for each new launch of a generation is the anticipation surrounding this 3-stage powerhouse, with fans eagerly wondering what it will look like, what type it'll be, and how it will fit into the competitive scene. A big part of this excitement is because there's only been one pseudo-legendary introduced each generation, with the exception of Generation 3, which had 2. I know, this may seem like a silly thing to vocalize an opinion on, and I understand that mythical Pokemon was just a term created by the marketing team at the Pokemon Company to separate those that were exclusive to events. I get that. However, I think this group has the best chance of making the franchise feel special. I miss the era of Pokemon when there were playground rumors about being able to find Mew underneath a truck, or being able to experience a brand new mythical for the first time through an immersive storyline. I'll give credit where credit is due. With the DLC for Scarlet and Violet, there was a newly added Petra event, similar to those we'd see in Generations 3 through 5, with a special mystery gift item that allows the player to learn about and experience the mythical Pokemon, rather than just being gifted it. It's too early to tell if this is what Game Freak is planning to do again for the future, or if this is just going to be a one-off thing before going back to the standard distributions. But I think it's safe to say that the majority of Pokemon fans, myself included, prefer the world-building aspect of the stories we used to get. These earlier events integrated perfectly into the game's lore. One of my favorite examples of this is the Celebi event in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. This event allowed players to travel back in time and witness pivotal moments before the game even started. Seeing Giovanni, the infamous leader of Team Rocket, in a moment of vulnerability as he leaves the organization is kind of powerful. And seeing how this affected his son not only adds a layer of depth to this already interesting character dynamic, but also made me feel a level of empathy I didn't know I could for a Pokemon game. And this was all thanks to a Celebi event. Now compare this to the launch of Pokemon Home on the 3DS, where you were simply just given a Celebi. I'm bored just thinking about that. Ultimately, the magic of mythical Pokemon comes from the stories behind them. By having fewer of them and giving them better stories, I think mythical Pokemon can feel mythical again, and ensure that each new generation feels immersive and is something to look forward to for players like me. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you for watching. I'm changing the setup of my studio at the moment, and I haven't quite set my camera back up, so it's forcing me to make different kinds of videos, and it's been a lot of fun. My usual style of content isn't going anywhere, but I find these little opinion pieces enjoyable to make, and I'd love to hear you guys' feedback. Alright, that's all I got for today. See ya.